I'm going to move on to a second topic, which is the decline and the preservation of Christianity in Africa. So we are leaping forward here a little bit, and we are going to the time when Islam is expanding and growing. Okay. So there were four indigenous churches in Africa. The Church of Egypt. The church in Egypt is Aikoptos, the land of the Copts. That's literally what the word Egypt means, the land of the Copts. The church in Ethiopia. There is the church in Nubia, and the church in what we call the Maghreb, but what they call the Africa Nova. So that would be Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. So that's kind of the layout of what's going on. So the key question is this: we're looking at the time of the Islamic expansion, what Muslims like to call euphemistically the opening of the nations. I was talking with a Libyan friend, and he said, "Oh, the opening of the nations." I'm like, "Yeah, we call that Islamic imperialism, right?" He's like, "Well, we call it the opening of the nations." I'm like, "Well, we call it Islamic imperialism." He said, I guess that's technically correct." I'm like, "It is." So this is a time when you have these great, this great, just unprecedented expansion of Islam from the Arabian Gulf and from Transjordan. So what is of those four churches, two of them survived and two of them died. Which two survived? Okay, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, Africa Nova. Two of those churches managed. Ethiopia survives, yeah. Egypt survives. And Nubia and Africa Nova, they do not survive. Those churches die. So we can think of the city of Carthage, for example. Carthage provided great saints and figures. Saint Cyprian was incredibly influential. We have the great martyrdoms of Saints Perpetua and Felicity and their companions under the Roman Empire. So Carthage was an important church. So my question here in this second talk is, why did these two churches survive and the other two churches did not survive? So here we're talking about mission, not necessarily in terms of like Patrick and Boniface of like sending out pilgrims for Christ. We're talking about mission in terms of the church being able to sustain its vitality even under great persecution and pressure. So any ideas? Anyone have any ideas? Why does Ethiopia and Egypt, why do these churches survive? And Nubia and Africa Nova are basically eliminated. Well, let's explore the question. So let's talk about the church in Africa Nova. Okay, you would think that if any church would be successful, this church should be successful. Like I said, it had given us great figures and great thinkers and great saints, and it was a large church, and it was an influential church. Well, first we have the Vandal kingdom. We know that the Vandals come down. This is where we get the word Andalusia. Andalusia is from where the Vandals come from. This is also where we get the word vandalized, because the Vandals were not very respectful of people's property and stuff. So there you go. There's some more etymology for you guys. We have the Vandal kingdom in North Africa from the year 435 to 534. Generally, most of the Vandals persecuted the Trinitarian Christians. So the Orthodox Trinitarian Christians, the Vandals were Christians, but what type of Christians were they? Heretical sect? They were Arian Christians, yeah. So Arius, of course, is this great guy from Libya, moved over to Alexandria in the 4th century, and he starts teaching that there is one God, we are after all monotheists, and that the Son is the first created thing in all of creation, so that the Son is created. The Council of Nicaea will push back against this and say, no, he is begotten, not made, of one being with the Father, okay? So that's part of the Nicene Creed. But the Vandals had been evangelized, I guess if we can use that word, proselytized, by the Arian Christians. So they were Christians, but they were heretical Christians. And they had extensively persecuted the Trinitarian Christians. So the Trinitarian Christian, by the time that Islam arrives, they've already been persecuted for some time. For example, they banned conversion for vandals. They would not let vandals become Orthodox Christians. They exiled bishops, and um, and they controlled two of the major cities, Hippo Reggio and Carthage. Hippo Reggio, what's the great saint that had been bishop of Hippo Reggio? Saint Augustine, and that's a city today in Algeria called Tagaste. We can visit sometime maybe. Um, so the Vandals had controlled both of these places that had produced great thinkers and authors for the church. Also, the church in North Africa, unlike the church to the same extent in other places, had a lot of divisions. If you study church history, you get to know all these divisions: the Donatists, the Novatians, the Montanists. We won't go into the details about the specific nature of each one of these divisions. Sometimes they were doctrinal, sometimes they were about leadership, sometimes they were pastoral, but the point is that the church in North Africa was already weak because it had been divided amongst itself and by itself for a long time. When the Arabs arrive, the Arabs are not agriculturalists, they are pastoralists, right? So when you have Muslim rule coming in, the Muslims would normally come in and establish rule in a city, okay? They would usually leave the villages alone because they're not that important, right? As long as the villages pay their taxes, you leave them alone. But what happens to the agricultural production when the Muslims, the Arabs, come in? The Moors have not converted yet, or the Berbers have not converted yet. When the Arabs come in, and they make a rule, and they say, you Christian farmers, you can never make the flock of a Muslim not eat your crops. Like that's forbidden because the Muslims, like the Quran says, God, the Muslims are better than the Christians and the Jews. I mean, that's clearly in the Quran. So what happens to agriculture? It's decimated, right? And what used to be a fertile land becomes infertile, especially with goats and sheep. They will eat the roots of the grass. So that means it will not come back year after year. So believe it or not, this region, North Africa, which today people think of as being a desert, was a very fertile part of the earth, but it just leads to desertification. We also have in North Africa another problem that we don't find in Egypt and Ethiopia, which is a lack of depth in terms of evangelism. Most of the people who lived in cities were of Latin descent, and some of them were of Punic descent. When we say Punic, we mean the Phoenicians. Okay? And we have villages here in Spain that were founded by the Phoenicians. They were seagoing people. They started towns and settlements all around the Mediterranean. In Africa Nova, you had three main people groups. You had Latins. These are people who had come from Italy, from Rome specifically, to live in the cities. You had the Punic peoples, or the Phoenicians, and then you had the indigenous people who had been there since the beginning of time, as far as we know, and those would be the Berbers. Berber and barbarian, they come from the same root, which is bar, right? Because when the Greeks and the Romans met these people, they didn't understand their language. They didn't speak Greek, they didn't speak Roman or Latin, they didn't speak the real languages, and instead of saying blah, 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 they said bar. That's how you said it in Greek. So barbarian and Berber come from the same root. It basically meant people who don't speak Greek or Latin. So, yeah, it's not great. And we can understand why Berbers don't like to be called Berbers anymore, although most of them, I don't think they actually know the etymology. You can talk to a German, or you can call them a barbarian, it would be kind of like that. Anyway. But the Amazigh, we'll use the indigenous term to talk about them, even though it's less commonly known. But the Amazigh are the ancient people, and the evangelization of the church had not reached them. We know this because we have some lists of representatives of churches at different synods and councils of the church. Most of the names are Latin names. Some of them are Punic or Phoenician names. We don't have any Amazigh names. We know that the liturgy and scripture, or these parts of the scripture, had been translated. It was available in Greek and then later on in Latin. Parts of the prayers and liturgy had been translated into Punic, but not in Amazigh. So this is one of the main reasons why that church in Africa Nova is not able to continue to exist once the Islamic imperialism comes in. Um, Most of the people who lived in the cities were of Latin and Punic descent. It had not reached into the villages where the Berbers were. There were some Christians among them, um, among the Punic people, but mostly it was Latin. Because Islamic imperialism tend to focus on cities as the and this is what any kind of military conqueror does, right? You take over the cities. If you can control the cities, you can usually control the villages and towns. Um, so they would take over the cities, and so the Islamizing influence would take place primarily in the cities. Now, oftentimes they would not go and force people to convert to Islam, but because of the jizya, which was a tax on non-Muslims, slowly, generation after generation, is what happened in Spain too. It just became convenient. It became incumbent. You can get rid of this big tax. There were levels of society that you could not reach beyond that level in the military or in trade if you were not a Muslim. So slowly, as time goes on, it just becomes convenient. It just becomes easy to acknowledge um, the validity of Islam and leave Christianity. There's also insufficient indigenization, and we see this in the names of the bishops. Again, they're all Latin names and a couple Punic names. That would mean also that the preaching and the evangelization, whatever took place, it would have taken place in Latin. We don't know of any texts that were translated into Amazigh. So that's another point, which is a lack of translation. Um, this is not a challenge today anymore. The entire Bible has been translated into Amazigh. So that is a very fortunate thing, and that was actually one of the things, one of the puzzle pieces that allowed for the dramatic expansion of the church in Algeria in the 1990s and the early times of this decade, although they're under a great deal of persecution right now from the government. But, let me talk a little bit about Nubia. The kingdom of Nubia officially ceased being Christian in 1323, just to show you how long that lasted. And at that point, though, it became a Muslim kingdom. Nubia was dependent on Alexandria. So this is probably a reason for, or one of the weaknesses of the church in Nubia, though, even though it held on a lot longer than North Africa, probably one of the weaknesses of the church in Nubia. That they did not have, I don't want to say autonomy, because autonomy means that you're independent. I don't think the church is ever supposed to be totally independent of other Christians and other churches. That's certainly not what we see with Patrick or with Boniface. But interdependent, you know. But it seems to have had an unhealthy dependence on the church in, in Egypt, based out of Alexandria. You have to wonder what would have happened with Nubia if it had had its own patriarch or archbishop, if it had been able to um, deal with challenges and difficulties on a practical basis on its own without having to get the permission or the blessing from Alexandria, which was difficult and could take a long time. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So a couple of questions. We've seen this. Let me say something about Egypt. There's something that Egypt and Ethiopia have that's already popped up with Patrick and will pop up again with Boniface. There's something that they have that the church in Africa Nova does not have: monasticism. They have monasteries. Even to this day, Coptic Orthodox youth will often go on retreats out to someplace in the desert to go and to have a retreat at a monastery. These monasteries are able to keep the liturgy, the language, and the spirituality of the church alive. After you raid the monastery once or twice and take whatever they have, there's not much point in going out into the middle of nowhere to some far obscure town to raid it again, right? Once you've taken their money, what are you going to do? You know, so the monasteries, to a significant extent, were indeed, I would say, left alone. after you raided them once or twice, you got everything you wanted, then you could just leave them alone. So these monasteries served as kind of centers of spirituality and tradition um, that the church in Africa Nova, which was really an urban church, like I said, did not have. So here are some questions, some reflection questions. Okay, what would happen to your church if every single foreigner was forced to leave tomorrow? Okay, because that's what happens with the Latin Christians, right? The Latin Christians, things fall apart, and they're like, well, I guess we should go back to Italy. You know, all these conquering armies are coming, they're taking away our things, they're giving us more taxes. We're going to go ahead and head out. Okay, what happens if all the foreigners have to leave? What would happen to your church if all the foreign funds were seized? If all the foreign funds were seized? What is the church relationship with the state? Is it healthy? Is it antagonistic? Or is it dependent? And then has evangelism penetrated into the small villages? Again, that has been a concern throughout the entire medieval period, and it's one of the weaknesses of the church in Africa Nova that led to its eventual demise. Okay, thoughts, reflections, ideas, criticisms?